Hi everybody, so today we're going to be talking about the carbon and nitrogen cycles. These cycles are really important because carbon and nitrogen are both necessary for all living things to survive. These cycles are examples of closed systems. So a closed system means that we aren't losing or gaining any atoms or molecules. Carbon and nitrogen are just moving through an ecosystem by being converted into different molecules. So over the next couple days, we're going to be talking about 4 different biogeochemical cycles. These cycles are called biogeochemical cycles because they are dependent on a few different types of processes. They're dependent on biological, geological, and chemical processes. So that's why that's where that bigger word came from. In order to keep track of how matter is moving through these cycles or in these cycles, we have to use some very specific vocabulary. The first word is a reservoir. So a reservoir is any component of a biogeochemical cycle that contains the matter of interest. So that means the atmosphere, could be water, could be living organisms. For example, if we're looking at carbon, living organisms store carbon. There's carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. There's carbon dioxide dissolved in oceans and other water sources. So those are all reservoirs for carbon. Now, reservoirs can be sources and sinks. They can either be a source or a sink, but most things are actually both. It just depends on how you're looking at it. So a source is a reservoir in which atoms or molecules are leaving. So it's a way like where carbon is coming from, where nitrogen is coming from, and a sink is a reservoir in which atoms or molecules are stored. So most reservoirs are sources and sinks. Some reservoirs hold things for a very, very long time, and so they're generally just referred to as sinks. So for example, living organisms are both a source and a sink when we're thinking about carbon. Living organisms are made of carbon. We're about 20% carbon. So we are a carbon sink. Humans, other living organisms are carbon sinks. But we also perform cellular respiration. That's when sugar molecules in our body are broken down with the assistance of oxygen, and we release carbon in the form of carbon dioxide. So we also are a source of carbon dioxide as we exhale CO2 and it enters into the atmosphere. So carbon is the most important element in living organisms. It makes up about 20% of our total body weight. Carbon is the backbone for large molecules like proteins, lipids, nucleic acids, and carbohydrates. These are macromolecules in living organisms. And there are 7 processes that actually drive the carbon cycle. So I'm not expecting you to write or draw this whole diagram. We're actually going to draw one in class. But I just want you to know these names and start to understand what these different processes mean. So the 7 processes are photosynthesis, respiration, exchange, sedimentation, burial, extraction, and combustion. So these processes can be classified as either fast or slow. A fast process is one in which carbon is just held there for a very short period of time. And a slow process is one where carbon is stored for millions of years or more. So our slow processes are sedimentation and burial. So these 2 are slow. The rest of them are fairly fast in comparison to sedimentation and burial. So all of these fast and these fast as well. So now let's talk about these processes in a little bit more detail. Photosynthesis and cellular respiration are things you're probably familiar with from biology. Our equations are in this diagram in the center. So we have photosynthesis on top and respiration or cellular respiration on the bottom. Photosynthesis is done by plants, algae, and phytoplankton. So animals do not do photosynthesis, just a reminder. And photosynthesis is when carbon dioxide is removed from the atmosphere by plants and it's converted into glucose with the help of solar energy and the input of water. So in photosynthesis right here, we've got solar energy plus water plus carbon dioxide forms these glucose sugars and oxygen. So glucose is super, super important for living things. glucose is a biological form of carbon, and it is stored chemical energy. So unfortunately, humans can't just breathe in carbon dioxide and use that as energy, neither can plants. But plants can create these sugars, and plants and humans can both use these sugars to form energy, and that's done by respiration. So cellular respiration is done by plants and animals, and this is how we release the energy that is stored in the bonds of glucose or sugar molecules. So in respiration, we have, it's just the reverse. So it's the same equation as photosynthesis, except reversed. We can see the arrow is pointed the opposite direction. But oxygen is used to break down glucose and release energy. The energy that we use in our cells is called ATP, and what we get is carbon dioxide is released, because we're looking at carbon cycling. So cellular respiration is a process that releases carbon dioxide from living organisms. Both of these processes occur very quickly, and they cycle carbon between organisms and the atmosphere. These are balanced processes, so that means just as quickly as plants take in carbon and make sugars, the sugars are used up and broken down and released as CO2 again. So there's no net increase of carbon in the atmosphere. These are balanced, super important. So another balanced process in the carbon cycle is called direct exchange, or it's referred to just as exchange. But this is movement of carbon between the atmosphere and the oceans. So direct exchange is when carbon dioxide is continuously dissolved into the ocean and then continuously released from the ocean into the atmosphere. This occurs at the water's surface. So in this diagram, we can see atmospheric CO2 is going into the water, dissolved CO2, got my arrows mixed up. Atmospheric CO2 is dissolved into the water, dissolved CO2 is released back out into the atmosphere. So these, similar to photosynthesis and cellular respiration, are balanced processes, so they occur at the same time. There's no net increase of atmospheric CO2 and dissolved CO2 in a natural situation. So some of the CO2 that is entered into the water is used by photosynthesizers. So these are aquatic plants, these are algae, and these are also phytoplankton. Additionally, as we have CO2 in the atmosphere increasing, so since humans have been developing more technology, using more fossil fuels, combusting fossil fuels, that releases a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So as these levels of atmospheric CO2 get higher, we get more dissolving of CO2 into the ocean. So basically, because direct exchange is a balanced process, when we have more atmospheric CO2, more of it gets dissolved into the ocean, and both of these levels of CO2 in the atmosphere and in the ocean increase. So this extra CO2 in the ocean is the cause of ocean acidification, which we'll end up talking about more in a later video. So some other processes that occur in the ocean relating to carbon dioxide are sedimentation and burial. So when we have dissolved CO2 in the ocean, some of that is also used by corals and other marine organisms that have shells. They take in that carbon dioxide, they combine it with calcium, which is just like that, calcium, and they form calcium carbonate. So calcium carbonate is the primary component of their exoskeleton, so their shells, or in corals' case, their, in corals' case, that makes up their structures as well. So sedimentation, some of that calcium carbonate precipitates out of the water as sediment, and it settles onto the ocean floor. So also, as marine organisms die and their shells fall to the bottom of the ocean, the movement of rocks, the wave action, other things like that, break down these shells and create sediments as well. So calcium carbonate sediments. Over long periods of time, the pressure of the oceanic water, so the oceans are massive. They have a lot of weight. So the pressure of that water compresses these sediments into sedimentary stone. So these are referred to as limestone and sandstone. Limestone is the primary stone type, rock type that you should be thinking about when we talk about burial. But basically, this is a really long-term carbon reservoir. So even though sedimentation occurs very slowly, because it has occurred for millions and millions of years, that we have this big accumulation of sediments, and then those sediments are converted into limestone. But this produces the largest carbon reservoir when we're talking about the slow parts of the carbon cycle. So we also have a lot of carbon dioxide in the oceanic water and also in the atmosphere. But when we're talking just about the slow parts of the carbon cycle, limestone is our largest carbon reservoir. So additionally, not only are sediments buried, but also dead organisms undergo burial as well. Not all of them result in the creation of fossil fuels, but a small portion of dead organic material does become transformed into fossil fuels. Those fossil fuels are extracted by humans. So extraction was not always a part of the carbon cycle, but since we have humans using these fossil fuels, taking them out of underneath the ground, this has been added into the carbon cycle. So this is a new process in relation to the history of Earth. And then those fossil fuels are combusted. So combustion is burning fossil fuels. And also we get combustion of carbon just by natural sources, by fires and volcanoes. These all release carbon into the atmosphere. So the combustion of fossil fuels by humans has artificially accelerated the input of carbon into the atmosphere. So with no humans, we wouldn't be doing extraction. We would have way less combustion of fossil fuels. But since we are here, since we are doing this, this has artificially increased the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. What that means is that it can absorb some solar radiation and it emits that radiation as heat in the form of heat. So it gets kind of trapped close to Earth's surface, that heat. So when we have more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we get higher temperatures. We get more absorption and re-emission of solar radiation. So that's why we're seeing this global warming phenomenon. Additionally, another human impact on the carbon cycle is deforestation. So as we are clear cutting large areas, taking away lots of trees, this means that we have less trees to perform photosynthesis and remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So not only are we adding CO2 in the atmosphere by performing combustion of fossil fuels, we are also taking trees away, which leads to less CO2 being removed from the atmosphere. So the second cycle that we're going to talk about today is the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is really important to living things as well. It's used to form amino acids and also used to form nucleic acids. So nitrogen is a huge part of your DNA, your RNA. Nitrogen is also a limiting nutrient. That means it's required for us to grow. It's required for plants to grow, but it's available in an ecosystem in a smaller quantity or a lower quantity than other nutrients. So basically what that means is if an organism doesn't have enough nitrogen, it won't be able to grow, even if it has plenty of other nutrients. So you could have enough of everything except nitrogen, and plants or organisms still won't be able to grow as they should. So in the nitrogen cycle, nitrogen undergoes a lot of chemical transformations. And when we compare this to the carbon cycle, carbon reservoirs hold carbon for a lot longer than nitrogen reservoirs hold nitrogen. The largest reservoir, so this is something you should know too, largest reservoir for nitrogen is the atmosphere. It is made up of 78% nitrogen, and it's primarily N2, which is nitrogen gas. So the atmosphere is the largest nitrogen reservoir. It's mostly made up of nitrogen gas. So we have a lot of nitrogen gas, N2, in the atmosphere, but what's important to know about that is it is unusable by plants and algae. So plants and algae need to take in nitrogen. That is the way that plants get nitrogen. That's also the way that herbivores and other consumers take in nitrogen. They have to eat plants in order to get it. But N2, nitrogen gas, is unusable. So what has to happen in order for plants and algae to take in nitrogen is a process called nitrogen fixation. So nitrogen fixation is the conversion of nitrogen gas into forms of nitrogen that plants and algae can actually use. So that is either the form of ammonia or ammonium. Ammonia is NH3, so 1 nitrogen and 3 hydrogen atoms. Ammonium is NH4 plus, so 1 nitrogen and 4 hydrogen atoms with a positive charge. So if nitrogen gas is converted into ammonia, it's rapidly then converted into ammonium. So basically in the end, what we get is a lot of ammonium ions. This can be done through a biotic, so a living pathway, a pathway related to living organisms, or an abiotic pathway, which has to do not with living organisms. So in the biotic pathway, this is when we have nitrogen-fixing organisms, which are cyanobacteria, which is a type of blue-green algae, and certain bacteria that live in the roots of legumes. So legumes are peas and beans. So when we do our eco-columns, we're going to be planting peas and beans in order to provide some nitrogen into that ecosystem. Also, another way that nitrogen can be fixed is through lightning or combustion. That can directly convert nitrogen gas into nitrate, which is also usable by plants. So these ammonium and nitrate are both forms of nitrogen that can be used by plants. So we have some other steps of the nitrogen cycle as well. I just want you to have some familiarity with these, and then we're going to make a large diagram of the nitrogen and carbon cycles in class. But these next processes, we have nitrification, which is where we take that ammonium that was created by nitrogen fixation, and that is converted into either nitrite. Well, it's converted into nitrite and then converted into nitrate. And this is done by soil bacteria. So the nitrogen cycle has a lot to do with bacteria performing these conversions. Afterwards, these forms are usable by plants. So nitrate and nitrite are usable by plants. So plants will incorporate them into their tissues through a process called assimilation. Animals also have to assimilate nitrogen into their tissues, but they can only do this after they eat plants or eat other living organisms. So animals can't directly take in nitrogen from their environment and convert it and then assimilate it into their tissues. They have to actually eat plants in order to do that. Then when an organism dies, a process called ammonification occurs. This is when we have decomposers. So these are fungi, bacteria, that break down organic matter, and they convert it back into compounds like ammonium. So it's called ammonification because primarily we're creating more ammonium. And then lastly, the last step of the nitrogen cycle is denitrification. This is when nitrate is converted into nitrous oxide, another nitrogen compound, and then back into nitrogen gas. So that kind of completes the cycle. And this is done by anaerobic bacteria, so that means no oxygen. So they do this in areas where there is no oxygen. This is places like water that have waterlogged soils. So it could be done in sediments at the bottom of the ocean, sediments at the bottoms of lakes, or swamps is areas where denitrification would occur. Then finally, let's talk about some human impacts on the nitrogen cycle. So one big impact is the addition of nitrogen into ecosystems by fertilizers. So farmers will use fertilizers with nitrogen in them in order to support their plants to grow. What can happen is that when you have these fertilizers with nitrogen, if it rains, that nitrogen can be leached from the soil. What that means is basically it's just carried from the soil by rain, and it moves into a different area, it runs off, and that runoff can enter into bodies of water. We'll talk about this in later units, but when we have nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus that run into bodies of water, we can get algal blooms, and this can be super, super harmful to these different ecosystems. And then finally, this is your practice FRQ for section 1D. So this included both the carbon and nitrogen cycles. Part A and B are about the carbon cycle. Part C is about the nitrogen cycle, and we'll go over these in class.